The beginning.
So, in the
Your
beginning...
name. Tell us your name.
Okay, so in the beginning, I'm Judith Burton, middle name Margaret. I was born in the United Kingdom, in London. I grew up there, I went to school there, and I went to art school. I was trained as a painter, and I did my full 4 years of training at art school, and thought I was going to become the greatest painter in the world. And then it struck me rather forcefully that it didn't just happen like that, so I had to earn a living. And at that point I wasn't really quite sure what I wanted to do. And I applied for the teacher training year, which was a postgraduate year, just because I wanted another year of college and I wanted more time to paint. And it came as a terrible shock to me halfway through the year to find out I had to go and do this thing called student teaching. And nobody really had prepared me to do this. And all my life I had resisted the sheer idea of being a teacher, so I really didn't want to be a teacher. Nobody backed into teaching more gracefully than I did. I really didn't want to be a teacher. I had all sorts of ideas about what it meant to be a teacher, and I didn't feel that I fitted any of those ideas. So I began my student teaching, and the second day I'm there, the teacher who was to supervise me fell down and broke her leg. And they said in the school, okay, here's her curriculum, teach it. So there I was with very little background, confronted with a bunch of high school students I did know nothing about, and I had to teach. And I shall never forget my first day teaching. That was going into a group of, they were then school leavers. I think they must have been about 15 years old. They were just waiting to leave school. And I had a pile of white drawing paper, HB pencils, and a stuffed duck. And I walked into the classroom, and I set all this up, and I told them, I suppose I must have said something, please draw it. And they looked at me, and they said, we don't want to do it, and you can't make us. Well, nobody had prepared me for this eventuality, and so I can't remember what happened after that. There's this amnesia that happened. But I do know that that whole experience of student teaching, much as I was resentful about it, I really started to like it. And what I liked most was the kids. The kids asked me questions I couldn't answer, even although here I thought I was going to become the greatest painter in the world and knew a lot about art. They asked me questions that I couldn't answer. And so I became very intrigued by these questions and why I didn't know the answer and where I had to look to find the answer, because it seemed to me that they deserved serious thought. And so I stumbled through my student teaching, and they hired me back in the school for my full-time job. And there I met, it was a big comprehensive school in London with 9 full-time art teachers, and with this most wonderful woman who was the chair of the art department. And she was absolutely extraordinary. And you know, if I look back on those people who have influenced various facets of my life, she has to come really high on that. I suppose a caveat there would be my parents, and I grew up as an only child, and so my parents gave me a sense that I could do anything in the world. So that explains another piece about me too. So Audrey Walker is her name because she's still alive. And she is now probably the most famous kind of artist who works in textiles and embroidery in Great Britain at the moment. She was just honoured with an MBE by the Queen, and her work is showing everywhere. But when I first knew her, she was head of this art department at the Parliament Hill School in London. And she was absolutely wonderful, because the one thing she did for me, which was terrific, she allowed me to fail. I would go and I'd say, well, I've got this great idea, can I do this, this, and this, and this? And she would take this brash kid, from art school, who thought she was God's gift to the painting world. And she would say, well, maybe this and maybe that, and I wouldn't listen. and I would just go ahead and do it, and it would be a disaster. And she would kind of pick me up, dust me off, and say, try again. And I did. And, slowly I began to get some sense about what this whole business of teaching was all about. She gave me, she taught me how to be in a classroom with kids, how to be at ease with them, how to talk to them, and I owe her that. The other thing she taught me, which perhaps won't be a surprise to you, those of you who know me well, she gave me an abiding sensibility to the importance of materials in teaching and the construction and expression of ideas. And that really does come from her. And she made me work at that. And so I began my life as a teacher and I was far younger than anybody else in this program, with them all kind of clucking over me and nurturing me. So it was a very, I feel very privileged to have had that experience. It was a very fine art department, and it was a comprehensive high school that went from kids 11 to 18. And what was important, since it was a big art department, every kid in the school did art. It never went as an elective. Everybody did it as part and parcel of their curriculum. And so that gave me a sense that all kids were capable of growing and developing in the arts. And it really gave me some insights about what that might look like if you had a bunch of really good teachers teaching well to all kids, that in some fashion or other the arts make sense to them as ways of thinking about responding to their world. So that came out of my student teaching too. Not that I think I knew it then. I kind of know it now because I've had cause to reflect on it. So I knew that the only way, I was learning a lot practically, but I thought the only way I'm really going to learn anything is if I go back to school. And it was unusual in those days. You took a job and you stayed in the job. And so I applied for and was accepted to do a further degree at the University of London, which I did, which took me into the kind of more academic world of the arts. Because most of my own training had been, practically in the studio. So for the first time I studied the theory of art, the sociology of art, the psychology of art, and put these two pieces of my life together, the growing theoretical insights and then the practical work I was learning. And I was very quickly, after I first started teaching within my first or second year, invited to go back to the college that I had graduated from to work with the students there. As a practicing teacher, they wanted practicing teachers to come and work with the students. So I ran a Saturday program for art teachers. Me, who knew nothing about this, I was just a little less clueless than they were at that moment in time. I was running this program trying to help them understand what they needed to know to go and be a good teacher. Well, of course, I had learned some things myself by then that had some kind of resonance. So I did that. And then I had been teaching not very long at all. 4 years, 5 years, when Audrey Walker, who was the chair of the program, moved out of school teaching into teacher education. And that began her rise, because she went from there to Goldsmiths College. She headed up this very, very famous department of fibers and textiles at Goldsmiths, and became this very famous person that she is now, highly respected as an artist. And she's doing all sorts of wonderful, I didn't know that, I thought embroidery was just sewing, but it's more like sculpture now. She's doing wonderful things with threads and fibers and working, materials in space. Just very exciting stuff. So that's what Audrey went on to do. And we remained very close and friends, and she always took an interest in what was happening to me, and that's very nice. And she was over here last year, And I introduced her to some of my colleagues here, to Renee and Olga, and we all went out, and that was very nice. So she left, and the question was then who's going to replace her. And so the head of the school asked me if I would step in to be the chair of this department. Well, I was terrified because everybody was at least 10, 12, maybe 20 years older than me. But I still thought, I was pretty sure of myself, and I still thought I knew a lot. But by that time, I was beginning to realize there was a lot of stuff I didn't know. So anyway, under enormous pressure, backing into the limelight gracefully, I applied for the job, and with their support, I got the job. So I wasn't very old at that point. So here I was head of these 9 people. And this was my next comeuppance, because by that time I knew enough to have some theories about what good education was about. And when you're young and you've got these theories and you're very wedded to them as being, this is the way to go, I try to impose those theories on everybody else. This is the way you're going to teach. This is how you're going to do it. When of course, like the kid who said to me when I first started teaching, I'm not going to do that, and you can't make me. That's what they said to me. You can't do that. And so that was my next learning curve. And I learned a great deal about working with other people. And they taught me a great deal about how to be respectful of different teaching styles. There isn't only one style that is suitable for everybody. People have very different teaching styles. For example, one of the people I inherited in this department was the head of department before Audrey Walker, who'd been my mentor, and she was then in her late 60s, and she had been a very famous art teacher in London, but she stayed on in the school to teach handwriting. She taught calligraphic handwriting, and she taught it to kids who were almost kind of not readers, and so she was hired to teach them to write. And she was very dictatorial. I mean, it's really old-fashioned educator. You did it this way and that was that. And so I would peek through the window in the classroom door when she was teaching, and there would be the kids sitting in serried ranks in dead silence, and they were obviously, they're hanging on every word, and she would be standing there, kind of laying down the law, and they'd get their pens out, and I think to myself, this can't be right. But I was too scared to go in there and tell her, maybe you should do this another way. And I did not intervene, because she was much, much older than me and much more experienced than me, but it grated this way of teaching. And then she put their work, their writing, she made them write passages of their own writing, other people's writing, then they decorated their pages, and then she plastered the school with these everywhere. And I cannot tell you how proud those children were of that accomplishment. She had taught them something and had really taken the time to teach them something where other people just gave up on them. And that was her way of doing it, and those kids adored her. They followed her everywhere. And so my notion that that was not the way you torture was shot through, because that's the way that was her communication with those kids, and that worked for both of them. And so each person I learned, each person in my department had a very different way of being with kids. And I think that is important. I obviously think there are better and worse ways of teaching, better and worse ways of being with children. But that can be played out in many different styles and forms. And I think those of us who work in teacher education have to become sensitive to that. So there I was. And it was very exciting, because it put me now in a different kind of place, and I would go to meetings with teachers from other schools, and I learned a little bit about kind of the larger world of art education. began to go to conferences, and in 1977, I can't remember when, I went to my very first art education conference in Finland. And it was really quite awful, actually. The level of the papers were really, it was an INSEA conference. And I remember it being not very good. And so a lot of people met outside the conference, the papers and the presentations. And it was there that I met Jerry Hausman, Elliot Eisner, Al Hurwitz, David Ecker, and these were names that I'd only ever read. And so I was, kind of over my heels with meeting these people whose work I've only read. It was so exciting. And they were talking to me as if I was a proper human being, It was really wonderful. And I remember when we were all breaking up and going off to the airport at the end of this conference, Al Hurwitz walked to the door with me to say goodbye. And he said to me, how about coming teaching in the United States? And of course my jaw dropped, and because it came as a bolt out of the blue. And he said, I like what you've been saying and your ideas. We'd love to have you in America. And I was still very British, and so I said, well, thank you very much. It was very nice to say that, but I have to go back because I have a job, and I have to go back to my job. So I got on the plane to fly back to London, thinking, that'd be wonderful. I mean, in that day and age, nobody invited you to come to the midnight just like that. And so I thought, that would be wonderful. I didn't say anything to anybody because I thought, it's unlikely, I'm not going to be able to do this. But it was nice to be asked. And that Christmas, Al and his wife Helen wrote to me and said, we would love to have you come and stay with us. You can come and do we'd love to set up something for you to do in the Newton Public Schools. There's a job at the Massachusetts College of Art waiting for you. If you want to teach in school at the same time, you can work in the Newton Public Schools. And it seemed to me that was, such an exciting thing to do. And another thing happened simultaneously, that in Great Britain there is this august body of inspectors of schools called Her Majesty's Inspectors of Schools. And it's like the epitome of if you rise to the top of anything short of being Minister of Education, you had aspiration to become Her Majesty's Inspector of Schools. And I got a letter at some point the fall before Al had written to me to ask me if I would apply for one of these jobs. And I mean, again, it was like I had these visions of these people as conservative ladies in hats, and I certainly didn't fit that kind of category. But I was very intrigued to be asked. So I went for an interview, and one of the things that slightly put me off was that it meant that I would have to work with the current Prime Minister, who was Margaret Thatcher. And because I had grown up in Margaret Thatcher's region in London, she'd been my MP for all my growing up, I didn't kind of fancy that very much. But I was very intrigued. And finally I decided that I did not want to be a conservative lady in a hat, although they offered me the job. They did offer me the job. I did not want to be a conservative lady in a hat. So I got on a boat and I came to the United States, not really knowing where I was coming, other than it was exciting. I said I would come for a year. I thought I was going to hate it. I thought it was going to be big, brash, and I wouldn't like it. But I was deeply and profoundly impressed to be asked. And so it's what I did. I came. I hardly knew where Newton was. I mean, I knew about Boston, the Boston Tea Party, and that was it. I had a cousin at the time living in New York City. And so I arrived on a boat, I came on a boat, and arrived in New York City, and I stayed with my cousin for about a couple of weeks. And very interesting. I'd been here 2 days and knew that I loved it. I absolutely knew that I loved it. And there were two things that made me love it. One, you know, I had grown up seeing movies of New York City, so it was very familiar to me, except it was now three-dimensional, it wasn't two-dimensional. So, oh, that's the Flatiron Building, oh, that's... And the next thing was I went to MoMA, and I saw all these paintings that I'd never dreamed of seeing. And it was just like, oh, this is wonderful. And so I went from New York City to Boston. And indeed, I taught at the Massachusetts College of Art. I stayed with Al Hurwitz, and who's been my other mentor in my life, and has been a wonderful, wonderful friend. And he and his wife Helen, I mean, they're like my family in the United States. And I worked with Al in the Newton Public Schools. I thought all American schools were like the Newton Public Schools. I didn't know that they were extraordinary. And so I thought, oh my God, you know, Great Britain has such a lot to learn from the United States. Because I thought, and then I got to know the schools of Brookline and the schools around that area. And they were all extraordinary, but I didn't know until I'd actually moved out of the region how extraordinary they were. And they weren't replicated right the way across the country. So I had a wonderful time teaching at the Massachusetts College of Art, and the year was coming to an end, and everybody was saying, why don't you stay on, why don't you stay on, and people invited me to stay on, so I stayed on for a second year, and still thinking I would go back home. And then people said, well, why don't you do your doctoral work here? And I thought, well, I wasn't sure why I would want to do that. You know, I was quite happy doing what I was doing, thank you very much. And I felt, oh, okay, can we think why, I should now take on doctoral work. And I obviously wasn't very clear about what that would involve anyway. So somebody said to me, well, you should go and talk to people. And, you know, in the UK in those days, you didn't do that. You didn't just go and talk to people. Whereas, in, you know, the great US of A, that everybody went and talked to everybody else, and it was very free and easy and open. So I didn't think I could go and talk to people, not especially when they told me I should go and talk to Rudolf Arnheim. And that gave me pause, because I had read Arnheim, and I really was a great follower of his work. I'd never met him, I'd never even seen a photograph of him, I didn't know who he was. And it just shows you how naive I am, is that I wrote to him, and he said, oh, please come and see me, and you know, he's come, I'm at Harvard, and etc. He was at Harvard then. And so I arrived on the Harvard campus, and immediately got lost, and I asked somebody, and I said, where can I find Professor Rudolf Arnheim? And they said, who? And so I thought everybody would know him. Of course, they didn't. So I finally found him, and he was wonderful. He talked to me at great length about who I was, what I was interested in, what I did. And so he sent me off to talk to a number of people. I said, don't think that Harvard's your only choice. So he sent me up to Canada and to California, to people he knew, and go talk to these people, they will advise you. And so I did that. And then I came back to Harvard, and I met Howard Gardner. And then I met Carol Gilligan. And so that was wonderful. And Carol became my sponsor at Harvard. And she was working at that moment on her book In a Different Voice. And she was very interested, because her background was literature, and she was very interested in some of the thoughts I was having about adolescence and the creation of visual images, and particularly about what that said about how kids related to their world, the role of drawing in constructing those self-other relationships. And so we had lots of very interesting conversations because she was thinking about the same set of issues in relationship to her abortion study, which then became in a different voice. And Carol was very kind of instrumental in guiding me through Harvard, and I was really very lucky that I worked with one of the most eminent cognitive psychologists at Harvard, Chet White, and the person who was a leading theorist and object relations theorist, George Goethals. So that and Carol were the three people who really were instrumental in working with me at Harvard. And so it wasn't an art education program, it was developmental psych, human development. And that was a wonderful experience. I absolutely loved it. And one of the interesting things for me, partly because I hadn't been in this country for very long, I was meeting, again, all these very famous people at Harvard who I'd only heard of by reputation and whose books I'd read. And we'd go into these seminars, and the American students would all be very, very easy, immediately call their professors by their first name. And I didn't know how to do that. It was very hard for me to learn how to do that. Professor this and Professor that. And I felt so awkward doing it because everybody was saying, well, Charlie and Fred and John, and being very easy with first names. It took me a long time to learn to do that. And by that time, when I was at Harvard, I had moved to Boston University, where I was then chair of the art education program at BU. And that was really very nice because we worked very closely with colleagues in music and theatre and dance. And I taught a course in human development to all the students from all the art forms. And that really was great fun, and I really enjoyed that. And I learned a lot about musical thinking and thinking in theatre and dance and etc. And then in the late 1980s, almost out of the blue, somebody contacted me and said, did I know there was a job at Teachers College? And I did know there was a job at Teachers College because they'd been looking for ages to try to find somebody to head up the art education program here now at TC. There had been a very famous chair of art education, Ed Ziegfeld, and he had left in the, I think, the early 1980s, and they hadn't found anybody to replace him. And so I knew there'd been all sorts of problems in finding somebody, and there'd been a kind of general decline in the program. It was called a revolving door program because people came in, lasted a year, and then they left. And so when I was approached, I said, I'm happy here at BU. I love what I'm doing. I'm living in Cambridge. I do some teaching at Harvard. This is a wonderful life. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. And so I said, no, I really wasn't interested. But they persisted and then said, well, at least come to New York for a free weekend. So I said, okay, I'll come down to New York. And I said I would come to Teachers College on the agreement that I wasn't going to be interviewed, that I really wasn't interested in the job, but I would come to Teachers College and do a tour. That's what I guaranteed, said I would do. So it was very, very interesting. It's one of these other occasions in my life. It was like, not taking this fancy job in England, but getting on a boat and coming to the United States, really not knowing where I was going. It happened again because, having said I was just not interested in this job here, they organized the weekend so that I met everybody on the search committee, but kind of in the corridors, and like some of them came to my talk, and it was kind of like I had no formal interview, but they made sure everybody got to meet me. And I knew that when I got back to Boston, that they would offer me the job. I had that sixth sense that they would do that. And I also knew, moreover, that I would take it. I mean, there was everything here to tell me not to take it, but somehow I knew I would take it. And on reflection, there were several things. First of all, I wasn't actually having to follow in anybody, a great person's footsteps. Ed Ziegfeld had been a long time ago. There was a department that had just kind of collapsed around its own ears, so that what they were saying, we want you to rebuild it, remake it. And the third thing that really clinched the deal for me was that there was a studio program here as part of the art education program. And that was really very unusual for studio to be with art education under the auspices of art education. That's why it is art and art education program here. So I said I would come, but of course that time I was still at BU. So, and of course I dallied so long in saying that, I didn't want it, that the year was ended, so that I couldn't give up my job at BU and come here. So my first year here I commuted. I did half the job at BU and half the job here. Teachers College was wonderful. They allowed me to do that, to come in for as much time as I could to start at least. And the first thing I had to do was find the students. There were no records, there was really very little that I could find of a program here. So I was given the mandate to really rebuild the program. And the first thing that happened once I got here, and I found about 25 of the students, I was told that I had to, there was going to be a state review of the doctoral program, because the doctoral program had been out of compliance for 2 or 3 years, and they were waiting for somebody to come in and take over the program, but now somebody was here. The following year they were going to do the review, and the following year now was 6 months for me to so what I did was I invented a doctoral program. It kind of was nothing really much here. So I invented a whole program. I wrote it up and invented it, and it didn't exist it existed as a degree that Teachers College gave, but it was not really a substantive offering. So they asked me who I would like to have as the adjudicators of the people who would come in and assess the doctoral program and say, yes, this is okay, or no, it's not okay. So I actually chose 2 people I knew quite well, and they came and looked at everything, and then had to produce student files and all the write-up, the course syllabi, etc., etc., etc. And they knew very well what I had done. I mean, it wasn't any secret, because they knew that there couldn't have been fully articulated doctoral program here, because there'd been such a mess for a whole period of years that with nobody really looking after the program. And to their credit, enormous support, and I will be in both of the 3 of them actually involved in the end, ever in their debt, that they said, yeah, go ahead, do it, and we'll be back next year to review it again. And they gave me a 5-year window, and they would come every year and do a review, and if everything was fine, they would pass off on it. They came twice, and then they passed off on it, and so that's how our doctoral program really evolved. And my next problem was faculty, because there were 2 faculty people here when I came, both of whom were pretty dysfunctional. And one didn't get reappointed after my first year, so we're down to 2. And the second person had been here, kind of man and boy. He'd been here since something like 1954. And he lived in his office, and he corralled a little, he taught in the painting studio, and he put a circle on the floor, and he put his easel in the middle of that circle, and he would sit there in front of these paintings, and these paintings would be like huge red canvases with a black cross in the middle. And he would gather the students round him, and he would teach from that perspective. And I would say to him, could you think maybe of another way of teaching? And he said he believed in professing, and he was a professor, and so he would sit and profess. And there was very, very little I could do at that point to budge him. So I was in lengthy conversations with the administration here, who've been very supportive of almost anything I wanted to do. They really were quite wonderful. And so bit by bit, I managed to hire more faculty. So my first hire was Renee, who I met, I think, at a meeting, Renee Darwin, who had just retired from the Board of Education. And I said, okay, would you come and teach a course for us? And as she probably has told you, she came and taught a course, and then before she knew it, was on the full-time faculty. So Renee was the first one. Then Prabha Sahasrabudhe from India was the second person I hired, and Graham Sullivan, the third, and then John Baldacchino and Olga Hubbard. What I've tried to do in the pattern of hiring has been to bring in people with different kind of perspectives, based around a kind of common core of beliefs and values we all share. So, for example, I represent the more kind of, the human development, psychological side of things. So Graham, a kind of socio-cultural side of things. John, philosophy and radical philosophies. Olga does the culture and museums. And Renee, the practice of pedagogy and instruction. So we all have our own little spheres within the program, and yet because we work very closely together, we meet every other week, we all know what we're all doing. So there's a kind of a layering effect, at least I hope, that works for all the students. So we've gone over the period of time since I've been here from something like the 25 students I could find when I came. We now have about 170 students. We're, I think, the largest doctoral program now in the country. So the program has, as we've put the faculty together, so we do more work with schools, we do work with museums, and we're now doing more work overseas in China and Japan. And that's the work we've been doing since around about 2000. So that's the story.
Judy,